my name is Mike Hennahane. I'm the president of the board of directors of Treasure Island Museum. I'd like to welcome you to the unveiling of our permanent installation dedicated to telling of the Port Chicago story here in Panorama Park. We at the museum and our partners are very proud of these panels. We've worked very hard on them, and we're very excited to share them with you today. We appreciate the interest that you're showing by being here today and our shared recognition that this is an important story that needs to be told. Before we begin the program, I'd like to acknowledge and thank some of the people and organizations who've been friends and partners to the museum and have made today's event possible. I'm sorry, it's going to sound a little bit like an Oscars thank you speech, but it's really necessary. Yeah, no one accomplishes anything meaningful by themselves, and I'd like to make sure everyone is recognized accordingly. First, I want to be sure to thank John Hogan, the director of the Treasure Island Museum, Melanie Garduno, our collections manager, and all the volunteers and the board that put in the hard work every day to make the museum run and make events like this run smoothly. You are the boots on the ground, and you're the face of the museum, and we really appreciate you, so thank you. Next, I'd like to thank the team from the Treasure Island Community Development and the Treasure Island Development Group. They're the people behind the redevelopment of Treasure Island. They are currently executing their vision of the future of Treasure Island, but we are very thankful that they also appreciate and are mindful of the past. I'd like to thank Faye Sen, the president of the board of directors of the Treasure Island Development Authority. I think she's here. There she is. Who, with the developers, the board has set aside this space of this amazing park for us to tell this important story. This couldn't have happened without you and your leadership, so thank you for that, Faye. We have Harpreet Sandhu, where is he? From Congressman Garamendi's office. Port Chicago is in their East Bay district. The congressman is recovering from cancer treatment today and could not attend, but we're very pleased to hear that his prognosis is good, and we wish him a very speedy recovery. Oh, the team from Hood Design Studios. I don't know where to begin. Wow. Alma Dussolier, who is the principal designer of these amazing panels, is here. When you see them, I think you'll agree that Alma and her team have created a work of art. Walter Hood, whose studio also designed this wonderful park that you're sitting in today. And I think you'll agree that it is a perfect example of their practice of art, landscape, and urbanism. And finally, the writer and editor Grace Mitchell Tada, the fourth member of the group that wrote and curated the panels. Next, Kelly English from the National Park Service. Kelly, I don't know what else. I think everybody here. You are our initial introduction to Port Chicago when you were in charge of interpretation there, and you've been with us the whole way on these panels, curating, wordsmithing, and most of all, sharing the determination of a bunch of museum people who didn't know much, but were hell-bent on bringing this project to fruition. So thank you so much. Jacqueline Caldwell from the East Bay Regional Park District. I'm hoping she's here. Oh, there you are. Great. Awesome. Wonderful. She's a naturalist for the future Thurgood Marshall Regional Park, home of the Port Chicago 50. We really look forward to that park opening and being another public site that will tell this Port Chicago story. Oh, Captain Jerry Tosco from the Coast Guard. He's the Coast Guard Deputy Commander right down the hill. Coast Guard has been on Yerba Buena Island for 150 years, and they have been a wonderful partner and neighbor to the museum, and we look forward to a bright future together. Leon Watkins and his partner, Larry Thompson, from the Walking Ghosts of Black History. You can see him in his great World War II uniform back there. We're so thankful to them for making sure that the contributions of African Americans in the military are not invisible and continue to be recognized. So thank you. We'd also like to offer our thanks to the members of veteran service organizations that are here. You guys are, for your continued service and coming here, this is for you. So please, thank you for being here. I would like to give a huge thank you to our corporate sponsors, PCL Construction, Netempo, represented here by Tim Irvin, and Gold Bar Distillery. Elliot Gillespie is here. There he is. Thank you. It's very gratifying. It's always gratifying to see that businesses, in addition to individuals, can see the value in projects and events such as this. So thank you. And finally, last but absolutely not least, I'd like to express my gratitude to all the speakers and the organizations that are represented here today. Thank you for sharing this milestone with us, sharing your knowledge and your time to make this a very special day. Thank you. So the last one. The speakers will be coming to the podium and introducing themselves to kind of keep things moving along. You can follow along in the program. So let me get out of their way, and let's hear what they have to say. Linda, could you please get us started? Thank you.
Good morning. Well, welcome to the most beautiful place in United States. Thank you. It is a great honor for me to be standing here today in the presence of so many guests, dignitaries from all walks of life, coming out here to Yerba Buena Island. My name is Linda Fadeke Richardson, and I am the Vice President of the Treasure Island Development Authority. The Treasure Island Development Authority is tasked for the development of the Treasure Island and the Yerba Buena Island. Before I start, there are key members of the Treasure Island Development Authority here, and I want to recognize the president of the board, Ms. Faye Shand. Please stand to be recognized. Faye is a well-renowned architect, Harvard-educated. Her signature is her imprint on these developments are remarkable and highly regarded. I also have with me here the executive director of Treasure Island, Bob Beck. Bob Beck, please stand to be recognized. This man is responsible for the day-to-day operations. He's doing all the heavy lifting. He's an engineer, and all the milestones. We trust Bob to kind of help us to accomplish that. And I'm looking at the audience. I see the staff for Treasure Island. I see Anne-Marie here, another icon, and thank you for being here. And we also have partners. This project could not be done without a collaboration with city agency. I see Jill Manton sitting from the Arts Commission, and I see One Treasure Island. Nella is somewhere around here. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about what you're looking at. When people come to either Yerba Buena Island and Treasure Island, they are struck with the beauty and what we are. The projects that we're doing here actually is on the radar of North America. There is no other project, in my opinion, that is really iconic like what you have here. And we are just started. We're not done yet. It took decades for planning. I mentioned before how we are going about the design of this place, the open space, the parks, looking at climate change, liquefaction, everything that people are talking about. We're building and solving that. And that's why the partnership with Stanford University, UC Berkeley, and all the iconic institutions are taking place. San Francisco alone is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. However, Treasure Island is going to eclipse San Francisco at some point. That's it, yeah. And so on behalf of Mayor Breed and the Treasure Island Development Authority, I just again want to give you all a warm welcome. As an African American, coming out here today is historic in so many proportions. The fact that in the vicinity of where we are, where it's Port Chicago, the 50 sailors, the court-martial took place here. What people do not know, and they need to understand, is that what took place here actually paved the way for the United States civil rights movement for racial equity. It all started. And as I'm standing here, I can fast track to the defense attorneys. Some of the members, their families are here today. I met some of them earlier. And also thinking about the late Thurgood Marshall, who later became the U.S. Supreme Court Justice and spent his whole life advocating for racial equity. Because of the work that was done, the injustice, the discrimination, and the bravery of the 50 sailors, that we are honoring today by unveiling the panels. What has happened ever since that, Colin Powell will never, never, never have had any chance to be in the chairmanship of staff in the United States. Since 2021, Defense Secretary Austin Lloyd will never have that chance. It was because of what happened here 80 years ago of this. And you can look at history, you can look at the integration, and you look at the progress that has happened ever since. The presence of you all today is a testament that there is hope, that when people work together, that the great things can happen. I remember several conversations with Mr. Bilofsky of the Treasure Island Museum. This was one of his life's passion as well. He wanted to make sure that on Yerba Buena Island, there is a proper place for representation, for visibility, and I commend the Treasure Island commissioners and staff for ensuring that this place that we have today is a reality. Where do we go from here? Well, I heard that there is going to be a permanent memorial for the 50 sailors. That's very comforting to me. And why is that? Even though the disaster happened 80 years ago, but look at what has happened ever since. Is it a coincidence that on July 17, 2024, that the 50 sailors were exonerated? And here we are, October 24th, 2024, and the panels in honor of the 50 sailors are going to be unveiled. I think it's a divine providence. And so to all the families that have endured all this time, and for those of their members that have moved on, be rest assured that justice might take some time, but ultimately there are good people in the world, like the people sitting here today, that make things happen. And so as we develop this beautiful place, iconic Treasure Island, Yerba Buena Island, and like I said, we've just started. This is going to be a point of destination. I envision that millions of people visiting San Francisco would take the time to come out here, see the beautiful sculpture of Mr. Sugimoto. There's no other place like that in the world. And that they will pause while they're here and look at these panels. And that children, school children and adults, will come out and learn about the history. That is what we are doing here. We can build a whole city within a city like we are doing here. But for me and my colleagues on TIDA, today is a historic day. It's an important day. And I salute you all. And to the Treasure Island Museum, Mike, I know you work so hard behind the scenes. And may God bless you all. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. I'm Hilary Grabowska. I'm the Supervisory Interpretive Park Ranger at Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. Remember Port Chicago? You should. These words were printed in an NAACP pamphlet in 1945 in an attempt to overturn the Port Chicago Mutiny conviction. So why should we remember Port Chicago? Because it is a story of America, a story of struggle and resistance, oppression, perseverance, change, and one where we can clearly and plainly see the dangers of segregation and discrimination. The disaster at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on July 17, 1944, did not need to happen. It should not have happened. 320 men should not have died. 390 should not have been injured. The town of Port Chicago should not have been severely damaged. And the men who were concerned for their safety should not have been put on trial for mutiny. But they were, and the disaster did happen. So what can we do about it today? On the night of July 17, 1944, the Bay Area shook. Over 10 million pounds of explosives had gone off. Hundreds of lives were lost, and hundreds more were changed forever. Port Chicago Naval Magazine was a vitally important link in the Pacific theater of World War II. Virtually all of the ammunition being used in the Pacific came through here. But this base was segregated, so the young and eager sailors who wanted to answer the call to avenge Pearl Harbor were Black and were severely limited in their roles in the Navy. African Americans could ship out and be at sea, but they would not be fighting. They'd be serving food to those fighting on the front lines or doing their laundry. Or, in the case of the men of Port Chicago, they were tasked with loading ammunition. Only they weren't trained. They weren't given safety procedures or even an education on what types of explosives they were handling. They were simply told to load and shouted at to go faster. There were warnings and appeals for safety to be prioritized, but the Navy willfully ignored them, resulting in the worst home front disaster of World War II. But the story of Port Chicago continued, because despite this horrific accident, which the official inquiry did determine was an accident, the Black sailors were blamed. And then they were told to return to work as if nothing had happened and without additional training. So they said no. And in response, the Navy tried and convicted them of mutiny, forever labeling them as the Port Chicago 50. These men wanted what everyone wants: to have a safe working environment and to be treated equally and fairly, but they were denied these things. The NAACP pamphlet ended with a plea that the pointless, meaningless death of over 320 Americans be given a point, a meaning. And so, 80 years later, we are doing that. The Secretary of the Navy took a huge step on July 17, 2024, when he exonerated the sailors. We give meaning every time we give tours of the memorial, the location where those men died. We are giving meaning today with these panels, and we give meaning every time we talk about Port Chicago. We give meaning so that we can have a different response when asked, "Remember Port Chicago?" We will say, "We do." Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Lee, and I'm an active practicing attorney, but I'm here in a different capacity. As a volunteer, I'm a director of the Contra Costa County Bar Association, and I've also, for the last 2.5 years, served as the chair of the Port Chicago Task Force for the Bar Association. I'm going to focus my remarks on the trial itself. Just a brief timeline. Of course, the disaster happened on July 17th. The Court of Inquiry that Hilary referred to took evidence until July 31st. By August the 12th, the command here had issued a memorandum back to D.C. recommending mutiny charges against the 50. So that's 26 days after the disaster. The rest of August, the prosecution team gathered statements from both the Port Chicago 50 group as well as the 208 who went back to work. And the 208 were tried in a summary court-martial, and I won't be talking about that. I'm now going to talk about the general court-martial of the Port Chicago 50. The charges were drafted and signed on September the 4th, and the trial commenced on September the 14th of 1944. There were 33 days of trial proceedings, and the trial proceedings concluded on October 24th, 1944, making today the 80th anniversary of the day of the verdict, the guilty verdict. The prosecution called about 50 witnesses in its case in chief. And the two main witnesses were the two commanders, Commander Tobin and Lieutenant DeLucchi, who established that the 50 men refused to go back to work. That was the evidence offered in the case in chief. The defense put on a case. They called about 60 witnesses. Each of the defendants testified. Each of the 50 members of the Port Chicago 50, standing as defendants at trial, took the stand under oath and testified. The prosecution then put on a rebuttal case of about 10 witnesses. So you had 120 witnesses, roughly, in 33 days of trial, a transcript that was 1,500 pages long. And the court deliberated on the merits of the charges for approximately 80 minutes. The guilty verdicts were rendered on October 24th, as I mentioned. And I want to tell you about some of the due process violations. There are many that we could talk about. I'm going to be selecting a few from a study of the transcript. Probably the first and arguably the most important of these is that the 50 defendants had 5 lawyers to represent them. So every lawyer was charged with defending 10 defendants. In a capital case where death is on the table as a potential penalty, that is something that, even under then existing Supreme Court law, offended due process. There were evidentiary rulings before trial that really tilted the proceeding in favor of the prosecution. For example, the prosecution was allowed to elicit evidence of statements by people that weren't identifiable. The witness could not tell you who the statement was made by. So an unattributed witness of a hearsay statement was received as evidence supporting a charge of conspiracy by the 50 defendants. And conspiracy requires proof of an agreement to commit a crime. The actual agreement is the crime, not the doing of the act. So this evidence was instrumental in supporting the prosecution's theory, and it was also inconsistent with Supreme Court precedent at the time. By contrast, the defense was not permitted, because the court ruled that it was irrelevant, to offer evidence of the working conditions before the disaster. So that meant that they couldn't offer evidence of the warnings that some of the very men charged with mutiny had given to the officers about the dangers inherent in the operations. I'm thinking of Joseph R. Small Sr. in particular, and I feel like today his name should be mentioned. The defense was not allowed to offer evidence of the regulations that the Navy had that governed the loading of ammunition and required safety training and safety procedures. None of that was relevant according to the ruling of the court. Basically, the defense was not allowed to offer evidence that was exculpatory, that would have tended to point to the innocence of the men. And on a number of fronts. To commit mutiny, of course, you have to have a state of mind that you want to overthrow the authority of the Navy. And there was ample evidence to establish that the men did not have that state of mind. They were merely protesting the working conditions, not wanting to take over the authority of the Navy. I also want to mention briefly, since his descendants are here today, that CYRIL SHEPPARD testified. And he explained that before he came to Port Chicago, he had been a gunnery's mate for 7 months. And he was eager to fight the enemy as a gunnery's mate. He described under oath that he never received an order to load ammunition after the disaster. He was aware of orders such as, "Will you obey any order given?" Sort of vague, amorphous statements like that, but not a specific order to load ammunition. He also was shown his statement, the statement attributed to him, which was a typewritten document, and it wasn't one that he saw typed or prepared, and he signed it because he was told that he had to. But under oath, he identified that the words used in the typewritten document were not the words that he used in the interview that he gave to the prosecution team. So these are just a few glimpses into the trial for you to help you understand the conclusion that we reached in the Bar Association and on the task force was that this trial was a carefully curated and constructed proceeding that had only one possible outcome, and that was the conviction of the Port Chicago 50. Of course, that has now been undone, and the Secretary of the Navy's order actually says that the charges themselves are dismissed. So the case no longer exists. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Thomas Brown. I'm the Deputy District Director for Congressman Mark DeSaulnier. I have with me the Senior District Representative from Congressman Garamendi Harpreet. It is an honor to be here on behalf of the Congressman. We've heard a little bit about the national park side, the family side, the legal side. This was a process that, as stated before, took many, many different groups of people to come together, and we're going to speak very briefly about the political side of that. The Congressman was one of many members of Congress that worked together to have the Port Chicago 50 exonerated, starting with Congressman Miller, with the assistance of Congressman Lee, Congressman DeSaulnier, and now with the redistricting, Congressman Garamendi involved as well. The fact that it took that many members of Congress and this much community support truly shows the extent of how important it was for this exoneration to happen. I do have a very brief letter from the Congressman that I'd like to read for all of you, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague here briefly. Dear friends, it is with great pride that our office is here today in honor of the lives of the crewmen and courageous survivors of the Port Chicago Naval Magazine explosion and their families. We are proud that after 80 years, these heroes have finally been fully exonerated. We were proud to carry that torch and build on the work of Congressman Miller, Congresswoman Lee, and Congressman Garamendi for the convicted sailors, their families, and the community for the many decades of fighting that it took to get to this point. We are grateful for the Navy for heeding the call, and the fight to correct these injustices were very long, but hope was never lost that one day it would be resolved. Acknowledging our nation's past is critical to building a brighter future. We all remain committed to sharing the story of Port Chicago 50 now and forever, and to continue the work and build upon it for equality and equity and justice for all. It is an honor once again to join you all today, and thank you so much.
Good morning. Good morning to the families, to organizations, and Captain. Congressman couldn't be here. We apologize for that. Congressman was at Concord Naval Base at July 17, along with Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro. It took 80 years for that event to finally take place, and here we are. As mentioned, it took 80 minutes of testimony, and 80 years later, here we are once again, celebrating, although it's bittersweet, what has happened here. So I will be short. I hear the music, as you mentioned, is coming up here. But what an honor to be here, to be able to celebrate this moment in time, and it, it's American history. So what is amazing, as mentioned before, whoever comes to this point will not only see the beauty of this place, but on the mountaintop, but also read the history. Perhaps in some ways, 80 years of wrongdoing that was corrected. So thank you, and thank you to all families for 80 years of waiting for peace to come through. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Tyler Bamford. I'm an official historian with the Naval History and Heritage Command of the U.S. Navy. It is an honor to be here today to celebrate the unveiling of these panels, which tell the story of the Port Chicago disaster and trial, but also to pay solemn tribute to the U.S. Navy sailors who faced racial discrimination and injustice while performing an essential and extremely hazardous wartime service to their nation. Despite the harsh and unfair treatment that the black sailors at Port Chicago endured, when disaster struck on the night of July 17, 1944, the survivors of that horrific explosion responded with courage that went above and beyond the call of duty. As fires ignited by the explosion broke out among the train cars loaded with ordnance, black sailors ran toward the flames rather than away from them. The commanding officer of Port Chicago told reporters afterwards how a number of these men moved, quote, boldly into a danger area around boxcars loaded with ammunition in order to quell the flames. The commandant of the 12th Naval District similarly praised the African-American sailors at Port Chicago who performed, quote, bravely in the emergency. He declared to reporters that, quote, as real Navy men, they simply carried on in the crisis in accordance with our service's highest traditions. Less than 2 weeks later, however, the very same officers who offered this public praise threatened 258 of these black sailors with imprisonment and even execution when they refused to return to loading ammunition under the command of the same officers who had fostered dangerous working conditions prior to the explosion. When 50 of these black sailors still refused to resume loading ammunition at Port Chicago, it was an act of great courage. Their trial became a rallying cry for the rights of African Americans in uniform, though they were not alone in protesting for equality. Thousands of other African Americans in uniform staged their own protests against unfair treatment during the war. In July of this year, Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro set aside the remaining 256 convictions of the Port Chicago sailors due to significant legal errors that compromised the fairness of their trials. But in order to truly right past wrongs, it is not enough to change the record. We must also ensure that the stories of those who suffered and died because of unjust policies are remembered. This monument will do just that by serving as a permanent reminder to all who see it. And when visitors come here, I hope that they not only read the words on these panels, but also feel the significance of this place and reflect that on this very island, Black U.S. Navy sailors stood up for their rights. Monuments such as this show our resolve to learn from the past and help ensure that these mistakes are not repeated. And so I want to thank the staff of the Treasure Island Museum, its many partners, and especially Walt Bilofsky for being the driving force to honor and remember the Port Chicago sailors through these panels. May they forever serve as a testament to the resolve of the sailors who were unjustly convicted here, and as a reminder to all who see them that equality and justice require, among other things, a willingness on the part of all Americans not to ignore the painful episodes in our history, but rather to acknowledge and constantly work to rectify them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Walt Bilofsky, Vice President of the Treasure Island Museum. And before I start, our board president, Mike Hennahane, forgot to thank one person, the person whose leadership keeps the museum organized and moving forward and forming relationships, and our president, Mike Hennahane. Thanks. You know, I wasn't going to tell this story, but there's so many friends here. I'm going to take an extra minute. Especially if my speech blows away, we'll have time. So the evening of July 17th, my phone rang, and it was Kelly English calling me to tell me that the Port Chicago 50 had been exonerated. Now, she was calling me in the morning here. It was dinner time in Stockholm, Sweden, where I was. But I was very glad to hear the news. And I was euphoric for about 10 minutes until I got the email from Alma Dussolier, the designer of the panels, reminding me that the last sentence on the fourth panel, which was already in production, said, "Efforts to exonerate the 50 continue to this day." Gives a whole new meaning to the term "stop the presses." So when you read the panels, I hope you will not notice that although the first 7 columns were carefully wordsmithed by the three of us and Grace Mitchell-Tata over maybe 2 years, the last column was rewritten in 1 week. So be gentle. So I'd like to tell you about the rediscovery of the location of the trial and the broader significance of the guilty verdict that was handed down 80 years ago today. History is most powerfully told at the place where it happened. And 4 years ago, the Treasure Island Museum and the Treasure Island Development Authority wanted to tell the Port Chicago story where the trial happened, here on Yerba Buena Island. So planning started for this installation, but the exact location of the trial at that time was still unknown. It wasn't in the trial records. All the newspaper stories said the same thing, on Yerba Buena Island or at Yerba Buena Island. It was almost as if the Navy, I don't know this, but as if the Navy were telling people to keep the location quiet. Robert Allen mentioned the building in his definitive book on Port Chicago, but he didn't give a location. So how to figure it out? What we started with, all we knew of the courtroom was 2 photographs, 2 existing photographs. One of them shows the 50 men, the lawyers, and about half the courtroom. And that's all we had. Well, when Naval Station Treasure Island closed in 1997, there was an inventory prepared of all 900 buildings that were ever on Treasure and Yerba Buena Islands. The inventory only mentioned one building as General Courts Martial. Well, maybe there were still plans for that building, after 75 years, and plans could be compared with the photograph. Well, we checked with Tyler's Naval History and Heritage Command, and they said that if there were any plans in existence, they would be at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, and we could go look for them there when it reopened from the COVID closure. And a year and a half later, it was still closed. But a very helpful archivist named Ryan McPherson, thank you, Ryan, took pity, looked in the files, and emailed me scans of plans for that building and a beautifully detailed Navy map of Yerba Buena Island from 1940. There was a room on the plans labeled General Court Martial Room. It did match the photo, and the map showed exactly where the building was, 300 feet down the hill from here. And now we know. And we hope sometime soon there will be a memorial to the 50 men at the site of the trial. Now, as TIDA Vice President Richardson said, the trial was the start of the movement toward the civil rights era. And that's a pretty big claim, but I'll prove it to you. And although the men had to wait 80 years for their justice, the Navy got theirs a lot sooner. Let's look at it. The Navy allowed press coverage of the trial, probably hoping to make an example of the 50. And they did that, but not the example they wanted. There was racism, there was Jim Crow, but by finding those men guilty of mutiny, the Navy put a face on it. Put 50 faces on it. So as Thurgood Marshall tried to get the verdict overturned, he and the NAACP were able to get public attention by talking about these men, these victims of unfair treatment, who had already been in the news. And that's exactly what the mutiny pamphlet did, the one that Ranger Hilary Grabowski talked about and the one that's shown on the cover of your program. The pamphlet interwove the improprieties of the trial with the humanity of a number of the men. The pamphlet was a focus of Marshall's and the NAACP's publicity campaign, and the campaign created widespread awareness of racism in the Navy and was a major factor in desegregation. It's terrible that the men and their families suffered so much. But had the Navy not overreached and charged and convicted the 50 of mutiny, that campaign never would have happened. That widespread awareness of racism would not have been created. And that's why the trial was such a turning point. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." At this place, 80 years ago, the arc of the injustice of the mutiny conviction of the Port Chicago 50 began its long bend toward desegregation of the Navy, then of all the armed forces. In the next decade, the civil rights era, and finally, the justice of the exoneration of 256 black sailors, including the Port Chicago 50. There's still a lot of work to do. You'll hear some of it from the next speaker. But 80 years ago today, almost at this hour, here on Yerba Buena Island, in a wooden building 300 feet down the hill, the arc of the moral universe bent toward justice.
Good morning. My name is Yulie Padmore. I am the executive director of Port Chicago Alliance. It's an honor to be here today. This monument to the heroes of Port Chicago is incredibly meaningful. And we have much appreciation for everyone who made this possible. I also want to express my profound gratitude to the U.S. Navy for exonerating the Port Chicago sailors and for their commitment to ensuring the family members receive the restitution, not reparations, restitution, and benefits they are owed. At Port Chicago Alliance, we are actively working with the Navy and organizations like Delta Veterans Group and Contra Costa County Bar Association to identify descendants, and help restore these benefits. However, we need your help. We're asking that everyone here today, we're asking for you to share the names of the exonerated sailors within your networks so we can identify and reach as many descendants as possible. I'm thinking about the great Willie Mims right now. You got this, Yulie, he would tell me. So yeah, we could use your help. We want to reach as many descendants as possible and ensure they have what's rightfully theirs. We have a press release available today, which outlines the process for seeking restitution, along with a list of the names of the 256 exonerated sailors. You can also find this information at portchicago50.com. Together, we can ensure that the exoneration has a meaningful and lasting impact on the lives of Port Chicago sailors' descendants, providing tangible benefits and long-awaited justice for their families. I would like to also acknowledge, while I have this opportunity, the fact that we are in the presence of the Fleet Week Grand Marshal, Reverend Diana McDaniel. So anyway, thank you all very much for your time, and we do have those press releases available, and please visit our website, portchicago50.com. Thank you.
This is Cameron Madigan, who is on our board of trustees with the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial. And this is my husband and chauffeur, George McDaniel, but he's been right along with us as we have worked on this. So I wanted to say good morning. I'm Diana McDaniel. I am the president of the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial, a nonprofit which exists to honor those who died, were injured, and those who protested the Port Chicago 50. And we've worked for decades to have an exoneration happen. We've worked for decades to keep the story alive. And it is wonderful to know that these men are no longer mutineers, but are known now as heroes. I want to mention Robert Allen, because Dr. Robert Allen wrote the book, and we call it the Bible. It gives us all the information we need about the story of Port Chicago, except for what Walt needed. Now, one of those heroes was CYRIL Oscar Shepherd. He was a native New Yorker. He was one of the few high school graduates working at Port Chicago, and at the time of his enlistment in 1943, at the age of 20, he was a mail clerk for an insurance company in New York. I think it's interesting that you are a licensed insurance broker, Carol Cherry. He arrived at Port Chicago 1 month before the explosion, and Mr. Sheppard was one of the few seamen at Port Chicago who had experienced sea duty. He served as, I think it was Jonathan that shared that he served for 6 months aboard a Navy vessel. The vessel he was on was a minesweeper. Mr. Sheppard was so traumatized by being convicted of mutiny that more than 30 years later, he had not told his grown son the story. His daughter Carol was not aware of the story either. But her older sister, Deborah, knew something about it. One of the things we have in common is that we're both family members of people who survived that explosion. I would invite you to remember our heroes, and these are daughters who loved their father, and they now have a little more information and a little more insight into the pain that he suffered and the service that he gave to our country. So please welcome two dynamic women, Carol Cherry and Deborah Sheppard. I'm standing up here. I have to say, I'm standing up here, so you can give them a seat.
Good morning. Me and my sister Deborah are really glad to be with you this morning. It is such a joy to be here to honor the Port Chicago 50 and to recognize the courageous actions immediately following the Port Chicago explosion. At 20 years old, our father, CYRIL Sheppard, faced a fork in the road that put him on a path much different than what he had hoped for. I listened to my pop's oral interview with Robert Allen, and I heard him say that many times when he was around other veterans discussing their military experience, that he would just be quiet. I found myself doing the same thing when I encountered people discussing their military service. I just stayed quiet. I never mentioned that my father was in the military. I wondered, what would people say about a convicted mutineer? Would they see the sacrifice of the 50 men who were tried and convicted of mutiny? Do they recognize the price these young men paid for standing up for themselves and the other sailors that were affected by the unsafe and unfair working conditions the Navy operated under at that time? Perhaps that is why he never told me of his military service or his military record. When I was here in July for the 80th year anniversary of the Port Chicago disaster, which was really nice, you guys did a great job with that, I remember my excitement as I looked for my pop's name on that memorial plaque. You guys are from here, so you know if his name was there, I wouldn't be here. But it highlighted for me the fact that although I saw him as a hero, that his name was not documented anywhere, which is why I'm glad to be here today. I quickly realized that the Port Chicago 50 were never recognized because they were still mutineers for protesting what they believed was right. In fact, none of them lived to see exoneration, nor to experience the feeling of vindication following their mutiny convictions and their less than honorable discharges from the Navy. On my drive back to the hotel, I reflected on the fact that the Port Chicago 50 died knowing in their hearts that what they did on that fateful day of August 9th, 1944, made a difference for others that followed them, and it was the right thing to do. I was saddened by that realization. I cannot adequately put into words how full our hearts are by seeing what all you've done to honor our father, CYRIL Sheppard, and the men of Port Chicago, and specifically the Port Chicago 50. This memorial will be here long after we are gone to acknowledge their courageous sacrifice. Our hearts are full of gratitude that you have allowed us to participate in the ceremonies and to honor our father. We wish Pop was here to feel what we feel in this moment. It's a monumental moment, and I'm glad that we're here. We are proud of him and his 49 other military brothers for what they did on that fateful day. Thank you.
I'm just thanking God, my Savior, and because He always talked about having a clean heart, and you all must have clean hearts to want to right or wrong, and I thank you for that. My heritage is grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Deborah. And we thank your father and you for his service. So I'm calling those who will be unveiling the plaques. We have Kelly English from the National Park Service and Michael Hennahane from the Treasure Island Museum, Alma Du Solier of Hood Design Studio. And I ask you that as they unveil, and they will be given a signal to unveil the panels, would you kindly whisper, thank you for your service.
So that concludes our program. Please enjoy the panels, and we also invite you to go down and visit the museum. Thank you.